Good evening, everyone. I am Adrian Miller, Executive Director of the Colorado Council of Churches. Thank you for joining us for this important webinar, Know Your Rights. I just want to go over some ground rules before we get started. First of all, this is informational. This is intended for churches that have ministries that are serving asylum seekers, refugees, and undocumented immigrants. This is not meant to be legal advice. The idea is just to give you an idea of the legal context, and then let you know what you can do within the law. And then if you decide to do something beyond that, we're going to have recommendations on what you should do. So I don't want you on your way to the jailhouse saying, well, Adrian Miller and the Council of Churches said I can do this. No, that's not what this is about. We're here to give you information, and we'll provide you some resources at the very end. If you don't know about the Colorado Council of Churches, we are a coming together of 13 Christian denominations, and we believe that we can do a lot more together than we can separately. Our mission statement is walking together in faith, working together for justice. And immigration is one of our important public policy priorities. The Colorado Council of Churches wants comprehensive immigration reform that recognizes the humanity and value of everyone within our borders, whether they are here legally or not. As Christians, the call to treat one another with hospitality and compassion is primary, especially when someone is a quote-unquote stranger. Think of the story of the Good Samaritan. The question of, who is my neighbor? In case you're wondering, the answer is everyone. What to do with the least of these? Do unto me, and to treat your neighbor as yourself. All of these scriptures entreat us to be especially kind to those who are different from us. The council must stand on these values of hospitality, inclusion, and compassion taught to us by Jesus Christ, especially in the context of the immigration issue it faces in our state and our nation. As we define the United States in regard to our immigration policy and the myriad issues which we are connected to it, we stay aware of the human ramifications. We are called to practice mercy and treat others with fairness, kindness, and true justice. We must be aware as well of the subtle and not so subtle issues of racism and hatred that brew beneath the surface of this issue. And we must be firm in calling upon Christians not to tolerate such bigotry and prejudice. Today's immigrants are not the first. In fact, our nation is a nation of immigrants, and we have treated and mistreated different people in an awful, painful part of our history, including the treatment of the Arapaho, Cheyenne, and Ute peoples on whose ancestral land most of us on this webinar now sit. As we struggle with these hardships, economic and legal issues that affect everyone, employers, employees, children, schools, hospitals, public services, law enforcement, we must remember that as a nation and a people, we are no better than how we treat the stranger among us. We are delighted that two immigration attorneys have agreed to lend their expertise on these issues tonight. Many of people of faith are facing in this time. When people are being arrested at church, we've got news of that today. Churches are being targeted for surveillance and violence. Remember, this webinar, again, provides general information on current laws. We encourage you strongly to get an attorney if your congregation plans to take actions that may put you outside of the boundaries of current law. So with that, I want to welcome our first speaker, Richard Garcia. Mr. Garcia is a graduate of the University of Northern Colorado and the University of Denver's Sturm College of Law. Mr. Garcia practiced immigration law since 1986 and worked as the executive director of Centro de Asuntos Migratorios in San Diego, California, and he was the executive director of the California Rural Legal Assistance Foundation in Sacramento before returning to Colorado and private practice. Tonight, he was going to talk about these issues. And this is based on the feedback that you gave us. So thank you to everyone who took the time to fill out our survey and ask what topics you want to discuss tonight. One is, what if ICE shows up at our church doors with or without a warrant? What protections can a church take to prevent deportation? What assistance can churches legally provide to non-citizens? And then an overview of what a green card is and what the process is to get one. So Rich is going to talk for about 15 minutes, and then we will have our next speaker, Hans Meyer, to present to you as well. So I will turn it over to you, Rich.
Thank you, Adrian, and nice to see you, Hans, doing the yeoman's work out there. And I hope we can provide you folks with a little bit of information just to see how you can figure out what to do with your congregations and how to deal with the flurry of issues that are coming forward in this past week. It's pretty remarkable, but it wasn't unexpected. So, what if I shows up at your door? Um, of course, they could show up with or without a warrant. There are different types of warrants. Uh, Judicial, of course, if they go to a judge and say, Judge, we need you to issue a warrant to arrest this person. Administratives, which um, most likely ICE will try to issue or to say, this person has a deportation order and therefore we need to go and pick them up. And of course, the thing we're probably most familiar with, search warrants that are always on the television about we need to come in and search for something. So there are a few factors that permit entry for anyone who's trying to enter. Of course, consent. Sure, come on in. I've got nothing to hide. Um, Also, there are exigent circumstances. We think that something nefarious is going on there and we need to go in. Um, Sometimes they'll also say, I had probable cause to enter. I saw them doing something nefarious and therefore uh, I needed to go in. Or if it's a closely regulated industry, um, liquor industry, for example, marijuana, um, sometimes where there's business that deals with children. You can also use that as an emergency entry. Um, so what do we recommend if they come to try and knock on the door? Um, First of all, remain calm. That's the biggest thing. We tell our clients, try to keep your cool. If you hear a loud banging on the door, um, it's very upsetting, especially when they're using loud voices or yelling or um, trying to get you to enter the door. Um, so remain calm, set up a system where if that happens, you're going to contact a lawyer or a person in authority that's going to be able to talk with the officer and see what's going on. The next thing is ask them for an ID and the purpose of their visit. Um, Ask for a copy of the warrant, what type of warrant it is, try and engage them and what the heck's going on. Without opening the door, see if they can slide it underneath the door or possibly show it through a window or somewhere where you can see the warrant itself. We also recommend that whoever's at the door try and document whatever's happening as thorough as they can. If they've got video, that's the best, maybe voice recording. But again, that's something that in the heat of the moment, who knows if that'll happen. We recommend that you do not grant consent if at all possible. We've seen where there have been tricks to the trade where the officer will try and get the person to open the door a little bit, and that can be seen as equal to consent because, oh, sure, they opened the door and we went in, no problem. When in reality, the door wasn't open, and they can use that as granting of consent. Do not restrain the agent physically. Again, trying to keep the door from being opened, they can consider that as restraint and use even more force. Okay. Do not lie. That's something that can really come back to bite you in the future if you are sent to court yourself. So don't lie about whatever's you might think you can get away with. And that includes concealing the individual or any kind of evidence that's sought. That can also be used against you, and don't interfere with whatever the investigation is about. Try not to get in the way to the extent possible. Okay. So what type of protections can a church take to prevent deportation? We have a sheet that we use that we give out to clients and other community members. I think Adrian might have a copy as well. Stay informed of recent developments. Um, the Lake and Riley Act was just passed, where the victim was assaulted and killed, and therefore they use that to say, okay, anything above a going into a store and doing a simple snatch and grab or even shoplifting is enough to render you deportable. And there are lots of facets to that. So keep apprised of what's happening with the Lake and Riley Act. And then just on Monday, a group of Quaker congregations filed a lawsuit uh, against the Trump administration, their new policy allowing immigration arrests in houses of worship. It was filed Monday in federal court in Maryland against the Department of Homeland Security, and alleges the Trump policy, quote, deters congregants from attending services, and is a violation of every individual's constitutional right to worship and associate freely. So keep your eyes on that one. It's going to be an interesting case that's going to make its way through the courts. Again, with our sheet that we hand out, what kind of remedy is available to a person? If they filed something or they're thinking about filing, we have a lot of people that are, I don't know what's going on and I'm afraid, but really see if you can help them to get their application in as soon as possible if they have some kind of remedy, because that can help to stop a removal or a deportation in many cases. Sometimes a lot of our clients have outstanding deportation or removal orders. Have them seek counsel to look at that. There are different remedies that a person can use to be able to try and maybe reopen that case or get another judge to look at it to see if there's any kind of remedy available. Okay. Same thing with the criminal conviction. Um, if the person went ahead and in Spanish they say, oh, it was easy, se me hizo fácil. I can, it wasn't a big deal then, but it can certainly become a big deal for anybody who goes ahead and enters a plea in municipal or county court. It might not be a big deal, but it can be a really big deal to ICE, and they can certainly use that to put a person in deportation proceedings. Also, recent news is that if the person can't prove that they've been in the country for a couple of years or more, the deportation agents have the authority to go ahead and say, okay, we're not going to send you to an immigration judge to fight your case. We're just going to go ahead and remove you, and good luck with that. Okay. If a person has applied for temporary protected status, the DACA program, political asylum, have them see if they can talk to an attorney about that and see if there's anything that they can do to try and extend those applications, or even try and get new evidence to bolster their claim. We have many clients who came years ago. They filed their applications for political asylum, but their cases are caught behind the other millions of people that are also trying to get an immigration judge to see their case. So see if there's any new evidence that has arisen in their home country or with their families. You can help them to translate documents, whatever the case may be, to try and get their cases up to date. And then finally help them with personal paperwork. Have you designated a custodian for your children in case they come and arrest you and try and put you in deportation proceedings? Do you have a will? Are your real estate papers in order? Your bank paperwork as well. How can we get your paperwork up to date? get it in a good file so it's easily accessible to be able to show the authorities. Okay, so I'm sure there'll be a lot of questions, but let's see what we can talk about it again in an overview of getting a green card, residency card. Okay, different ways to get legal residence. Most often with our office, family visas that family member can apply for your spouse, your children when they turn 21. If you don't have documents, they can apply for you if they were born here. Sometimes if you entered legally, the place of business where you work can maybe file a petition for you. And there are many, of course, cases of political asylum, where if based on your race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or membership in a particular social group, you can try and say, I have fear of returning to my home country. Now, subgroup of that is asylum. And if you don't file your application within a year, then you're kicked into another category that's much more difficult to try and gain. Whereas asylum, you're saying that your fear of returning is reasonable. But if you wait longer than a year, it could be the fact that you have to prove that it's more likely than not that you're going to be harmed, mistreated, killed, persecuted, etc. So that's really a difficult concept to try and meet. Okay. I don't know if I have anything else. I'll certainly turn it over to Hans, who is much more adept in trying to fight the good fight on behalf of our immigrant clients, and we hope that we can provide you with some good information and good counsel.
All right, thank you so much, Rich. I appreciate you. Just before you start, Hans, again, if you have questions, please use the Q&A function, not the chat. It's in your navigation bar on the bottom. You should see Q&A and a question mark. So please use that. We already have some great questions coming in. And then closed caption has been enabled. Some of you said it wasn't working well. I tried it and it was working for me in Spanish. So you'll see a CC in a box. So make sure that you pick the right language for you. And if it's not working on the recording, we will work to make sure that that has Spanish subtitles as well. All right, so our next presenter is Hans Meyer. Hans is the founder of the Meyer Law Office, PC. His practice specializes in immigration law and removal defense, criminal defense, and post-conviction relief, the immigration consequences of crimes, and the civil rights of immigrants. Hans advocates for the statutory and constitutional rights of immigrants before various immigration agencies and state and federal courts, often against governmental and institutional abuses of power. He is the former trial attorney within the Colorado State Defender's Office, where he became an expert in the film of crimigation. I'm gonna have to get you for making up words, man. You think you're a hip hop artist? Law, and developed a statewide immigration advisement system for indigent non-citizen defendants. Hans also served as the former director of public policy for the Colorado Immigration Rights Coalition, where he focused on local, state, and national immigration policy. Thank you for joining us, Hans.
Thank you so much, Adrian, and thank you to everybody. I know we have 81 people on right now from the Colorado Council of Churches. I just want to thank you for putting this forum together, for expressing interest, for showing solidarity, and for marrying your faith to action. So it means a lot, really means a lot to us who are working in this area. And thank you, Rich. And Rich gave a great introduction on all the constitutional and legal issues at play related to contact with immigration officials, as well as with law enforcement, pathways to a green card. And so, Rich, if I'm talking, if you've got other stuff you want to add in, I'd love to have your thoughts on it. Adrian, did you want to address, or Rich, did you want to address any of the questions that have come up yet, or do you want to wait until sort of afterwards? What's better for you?
Let's wait till afterwards. And I forgot to mention, what you will be addressing is the current state of sanctuary laws. What rights do non-citizens have? What are the rights of church staff and volunteers who assist non-citizens? What are the things that churches can do that other institutions cannot? And what resources do you recommend for additional education on the subject? So forgot to set the table for you. So go ahead. Yeah, we'll take questions after you get done.
Thank you. Yeah, let's address one. But before we get there, I just wanted to say, uh, back in the first Trump administration, and prior to that administration, I had worked in with a lot of congregations who were providing sanctuary to people who were living within the church itself. One of the most famous ones was Jeanette Vizgera, who I'm sure many people on this video or call are aware of. And so I did a lot of work with congregations in terms of discussions and legal preparation plans and walking through the logistics and maybe issues, both in terms of illegal exposure and preparation and trying to mitigate that. So, and in that process, I just really came to appreciate how profoundly faith communities can impact the dial of public discourse and help us put back in a barometer of looking at what's right to do in our country through the lens of faith. So thank you. I just wanted to let you know that. I'm going to start off with a quote too. I know you had a quote, Adrian, walking together in faith, working together for justice. And I wanted to supplement that with a quote. And this is not a faith community quote, but it's a quote, I think, from George Orwell, which is, in a time of universal deceit, telling the truth is a revolutionary act. And bearing witness and being people of faith, standing with immigrant communities, is telling the truth. So I also want to thank you for that. Okay, current state of sanctuary laws. That's question number one. Let me walk through a couple of these. The term sanctuary law is a little loose and it's a little complicated, but let's just kind of try to unpack it a little bit. We'll talk about what we have here in Denver as well as in Colorado. When I'm going to use the term sanctuary law, I'm going to talk about laws and policies passed by local or state governments that extract local and state governments from being forced to participate in immigration and customs enforcement actions. That's essentially what I'm going to talk about when I talk about sanctuaries. Let's talk about Denver. Denver has an ordinance that we worked really hard to put into place in 2016 and 2017. It does a couple of things. It number one, asks people who are employees or instructs people who are employees not to collect immigration status information unless it's absolutely necessary or required by federal law. That's important because if you don't have it, you're not required to give it to somebody if they subpoena you or try to obtain your records. So in some ways, if it's not relevant to service the city is providing, then we don't need to collect it. Number two, we don't affirmatively share information with immigration unless it's required under certain limited sections of federal immigration law. Number three, we don't use city resources to facilitate or assist in civil immigration enforcement. It's an important point. Civil immigration enforcement. We're not talking about criminal laws. We're not talking about criminal charges. Immigration enforcement is civil. And as a civil matter, it's kind of like the IRS enforcing a tax matter. That's fine. The IRS can enforce its tax matter, but a local city official or a local police officer doesn't enforce tax matters for the federal government. And under that same analysis, the city doesn't do that for federal immigration agents either. We also created limitations to secure areas of certain city property so that absent a warrant or a judicially signed warrant, like Rich mentioned, ICE officers can't go into certain places where it might not be open to the public. So if they're not invited and they don't have a warrant to access those particular areas, then they're not allowed in those areas. And that would include things like the waiting room the secure areas of the Denver County Jail, because we want a very clear line between local interests and federal interests. And some other things as well, not honoring immigration detainers, which gets me to state sanctuary protections. We passed these in 2018, 2019, 2020, 2021, and 2022 after the local sanctuary or the local immigrant protection ordinance that we passed. This is a very important set of protections. And I want to actually kind of hold this up for a moment as something very, very positive in our community. I would say that in Colorado and Denver, our community has worked hard for about 15 years to put into place laws and protections that honor the constitutional and civil rights of our immigrant communities in a way that probably 47 other states don't do. We are really at the top of our game in providing those protections. I think that's important because in a moment of a full-scale propaganda war being waged, frankly, by the Trump administration, and a lot of panic and fear and concern in community, it's very important for us to understand what is and isn't allowed in our local and state governments and the protections that we built in. So number one, and most important, local law enforcement do not have authority, period, ever, under any circumstances, to conduct civil immigration arrests. Let me repeat that. Local law enforcement do not have authority to conduct civil immigration arrests or make civil immigration arrests. They could call immigration, but they cannot arrest somebody because that person's undocumented or has a removal order, or they think that person could be deportable from the country. There's important policy reasons for that, right? Because if local immigrant communities can't trust local police, they're not going to report crimes. They're not going to participate in the legal system. They're not going to call when they see you get robbed, right? And report that crime because they're too terrified. And that has been a really hard fight we've had over the last 10 years. And the people who were with us in that struggle were oftentimes local law enforcement because they know that people need to be able to trust them. And they're not, they may have an opinion about immigrants, but they understand that's what's more important about that is being able to trust state and local actors. That's a very important piece. An outgrowth of that, as a result of the fact that they have no legal authority to make those arrests, local county jails cannot hold a person on something called an immigration detainer once that person is otherwise free. So, for example, a person gets arrested for driving without a license and driving with no insurance and maybe careless driving, right? They're rushing home from work. They're going 25, 30 miles over the speed limit. They get arrested, taken to jail, and they get what's called a personal recognizance bond. So they can immediately get out because it's not that serious of a case. It used to be that people would be held in those jails and turned over to ICE. At this point, nowhere in Colorado is any sheriff allowed to hold anybody longer than when they're either posting bond or released on a PR bond or released from custody. And that is a really important distinction as well. Those two things are probably the most important. The third thing is that we've built in privacy protections. One is in the probation department context so that people, if they've made a mistake and if they've taken accountability for that, can engage in the rehabilitative process without fear of being arrested while they're trying to do the right thing. Number 4, we bar ICE arrests in courthouses in Colorado. And this is a unique state law that says courthouses for us are important places of local and state interest. People need to get married there. They need to file paperwork there. They need to pay fines there. They need to show up for jury service there. They need to become witnesses there or victims, or they need to show up and take care of a case. And when that location is not safe, people won't show up. And that is exactly what was happening because ICE was arresting people at courts when they were showing up, trying to do the right thing. So we have built in a protection that prohibits those arrests. Finally, we've got a couple of other things here in Colorado that are super important. Data privacy. This permeates state agencies so that a person can go get a driver's license. They can get licensed and insured and drive safely in the state of Colorado without fear that their information is going to be shared to ICE. And we have those protections that permeate other state agencies as well. We also have in-state tuition and people have rights to licenses. So a lot of people are able to live a life in which they can commute, they can follow the law, they have valid licensing, they can pursue higher education, and they don't necessarily have to fear local or state law enforcement if they just have a contact. Now, I do want to be clear. There's a full frontal assault on all of those state and local law protections in the last 10 days. The ICE is trying to violate all of those protections, period. And so we're going to have to fight to defend those. But that's the summary of state and local protections for us. And that's basically the summary of what we have in terms of sanctuary laws here in Colorado. Now, there's others and there's some more nuance and details, but that's sort of the top line. Number two, and Adrian, you want me to kind of go through the four and then open it up for questions for Rich and I? Okay, great. Number two, and I think that's probably the most important thing to remember. And I have a fact sheet on this that I'll provide to Adrian that maybe would be helpful for people in community to share with people in their faith communities, because I actually think it's very important for us to understand the protections we do have in place. Because we are going to have to talk about some of the difficulties, but it is important to remember that our community has worked really hard to make immigrant communities feel welcome. We want to make sure people know about that. Number two, what are the rights of non-citizens, church staff, and volunteers in encounters, I'm assuming, with either local law enforcement or federal immigration agents? We'll maybe lean a little more towards the federal immigration agent side of things, given the nature of this conversation. Short top line is non-citizens and citizens have the exact same constitutional rights in any encounter with law enforcement. These generally include what are called the Fourth Amendment rights, the Fifth Amendment rights, and the Sixth Amendment rights. Without getting too far into the weeds, the Fourth Amendment rights include the right to remain silent if you're contacted and detained by a peace officer or by ICE for some sort of questioning. We have zero obligation to answer any question asked by law enforcement, whether it's a friendly question, whether it's a neutral question, or whether it's a hostile question. And people have to sort of manage that discussion or manage that situation as they see fit. But as a general rule in our office, what we tell people is be respectful, be calm, be thoughtful and kind, but absolutely demand your rights. And that right is, I wish to remain silent, or I don't want to answer any questions. That's a very important right, and it's probably the hardest one to assert, honestly. Also, if a person's arrested, they have a right to demand the ability to speak with counsel. And they also have the right to ask to see counsel, right? And that would happen in a local law enforcement context or in an immigration context. So if a person is arrested, one of the first rights we tell people is to invoke their right to talk to an attorney. And primarily talk to an attorney before they answer any additional questions by law enforcement or by ICE. The way we see this play out and the way that it often happens on the street is ICE would approach somebody. It's a very intimidating experience, right? They would begin to ask them questions. Can I see your ID? If a person doesn't say have an ID, say, why don't you have an ID? And they're like, well, I can't get an ID. And they're like, well, why is that? And they're like, because I don't have papers. And that right there gives immigration agents enough to arrest that person. But if immigration agents come up and start questioning somebody without any basis to think that they're undocumented, but they're using maybe an inappropriate proxy, race, right? Language skills, location in a particular spot, like a restaurant or something where people would say, oh, I think lots of immigrants go there. That's an unlawful basis to detain somebody and question them. But the more important thing for immigrant communities is to make sure they exercise their rights not to provide any additional information that a law enforcement officer or immigration agents could use to basically justify or to gin up a basis to arrest them or detain them. There's also really important rights, and Rich kind of went through these, so I'm just going to touch the top lines, is there's always the right not to consent to a search. And there's a lot of subtleties around searches. Is it a public place? Is it a private place? For example, if it's a church and there's like a public entryway that anybody can access, but then after that, there's private areas, whether it's, religious service areas or offices or daycare facilities or whatever, there's different, there's different protections at play in that. But the fundamental rule that we always tell people to follow is you don't give consent. If you don't want to give consent, don't give consent. I do not consent to you entering this space. I do not consent to a search of my person. I do not consent to a search of my car or my bag or anything else that I own. And to do so in the same, cadence and the same form of respect, because I think tone is important here when we're trying to strike the right balance. But so those Fourth, Fifth, and Sixth Amendment rights are very important. Now, there's a question offshoot about this, about church staff, right? And this raises some more interesting questions about, do certain congregations want to develop a certain flow or game plan for if they're contacted by immigration agents or if they're contacted by local law enforcement. I would encourage people to think about that if it's relevant to your faith congregation or your faith community. Because, you know, in a church, there's also reasonable expectations of privacy for lots of areas in the church. And the church or a faith community can choose to classify and change the way certain areas are structured so that they're private. And if they're private, you can't go into them without a warrant or consent, right? So those are important things to think about. And that might be sort of some thinking through church staff through like a flow chart about how to best respond. You know, if you're contacted by immigration officials and they say, hey, I want to talk to people inside the right after the service or during the service, or I want to go talk to people in this Bible study meeting. Or if they show up with an administrative warrant that is supposed to authorize their arrest of somebody. Because those administrative warrants that ICE has, they're not real warrants, period. And so ICE can't go in to private spaces to execute those warrants if they don't have consent. That's really important to remember. So I could show up with a warrant for Rich Garcia as an ICE agent, but it's not signed by a judge. It doesn't articulate probable cause. So in some ways, it's like a phony warrant. But if I can talk you into letting me in because you're scared or you want to make me feel good or you want to placate me, then I can go in and arrest that person. But those are sort of things that like staff and people who work in faith communities may want to think through, like, is there a way for us to put together a game plan that is both respectful, but also asserts and protects our rights and as an organization and the rights of our members. And so that may be something individually different congregations may want to do. I think the third thing, and I know I'm running short on time, so I'm going to try to go through this a little bit faster. The third question was, can churches do things that other institutions cannot? And I would say, like, as a legal matter, the answer is probably no, right? There's the lawsuit that Rich talked about, which I think is a really interesting way to try to defend faith communities, because executing and conducting immigration arrests and interrogations in faith communities is a chilling on the free exercise of religion, right? Like that's the theory in that case. I think it's a good theory. But in terms of more rights, the church or a faith community doesn't have more rights simply because they're a faith community. However, what they do have is a lot of moral authority and a lot of community power. And I think that's a very important thing. It's what I would call soft power, right? It's not legal power. It's not a legal hook, but it's absolutely how those communities during the first Trump administration protected people from deportation was through collective action and using the faith community and the power of faith as a protection or as a way to try to defend people from something they view as unjust, right? So, and that again goes into a larger conversation about risk and reward and analysis for different particular congregations at a moment in history that is really unprecedented. The one little exception I'd say to that is like a faith community or a church is building, and people in a building in certain private areas of that building, if it's not open to the public completely, have a higher expectation of privacy. And with a higher expectation of privacy, ICE or local law enforcement need to justify being able to pierce that privacy, right? So the more that there's areas of the church that are private for members or members' families or whatever the private group of people is, the more likely that an officer is going to need a judicial warrant to be able to enter or search or detain somebody within that area. Whereas in a public area like a park or the parking lot, although the parking lot itself is also private property, right? In a public space aren't necessarily as constrained by that because it's out in public. Lastly, resources for additional education. I think this is a really excellent question, and there's a lot of resources out there. I mean, I think going to our local or national ACLU to pull down basic Know Your Rights information is super helpful. There's also information through organizations such as the Colorado Immigrant Rights Coalition that talks through things. And my office has prepared a couple of very specific Colorado-specific things One of them is a fact sheet on state and local sanctuary laws or laws that protect immigrant communities, which I can share with you, Adrian. We have that in English and Spanish. We also have our version of Know Your Rights stuff too. It's not necessarily any different than anybody else's, but we have it catered for immigrant community members, maybe a little bit more for contact with ICE. Um, and then information regarding like some of the assaults or some of the changes in executive orders to come after some of our policies. For example, the Trump announcement of safe spaces, rescission of safe spaces, right? And what does that mean? And how can we document that? And how can we mount both a community response and a potential legal response? So I'll share those with you, Adrian, to the extent other people are interested. But again, you can go to the ACLU, you can go to a local nonprofit organization that has Know Your Rights information and get that. That's a good place to start. I think the last place on resources is, if you have a congregation or a faith community that has a high immigrant population, that serves immigrant populations, that's been public in your solidarity work with immigrant populations, I do think it makes sense for you to find a team, like a legal team or an attorney, or maybe somebody in your network to put together a game plan. And that game plan doesn't have to be super complicated, but it should take a little while to put together like a legal flow chart of things to do, the people in your organization who might need to be trained or want to be trained, and sort of a list of like steps in case you are contacted. And I think, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure in this sense of, but just being prepared in the event something happens, that everybody can remain calm, make the right decision, and use the resources available to them, including whether that's an attorney or an organization, to support them in that moment if something happens. So I think with that, Adrian, I don't really have anything else related to those questions, and I want to make sure we leave plenty of time for Q&A.
Absolutely. All right, thank you. So we have several questions. Now we said we're going to end at 7:30, but we want to get these questions answered. So we will try to move through. So Rich and Hans, if you could just give a couple minutes in your answers, I think we'll be able to cover a lot of them. So and both of you, if you could open up the Q&A, there is a question in Spanish. And so if one of you is comfortable answering that question, that would be great. But I'm going to go down the questions as they exist right now. The first question is, will you be able to address what's happening in asylum court since January 20th? We have a family supported by Montview who are here under CBP1 and facing routine check-in on Thursday. We're worried that they'll be detained and worry about what will happen with their minor children. Do you want to take that one, Hans?
Sure.
Or Rich? Or yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think both Rich and I could maybe offer some thoughts on this because this is an excellent question, and it is the most timely question. We have a memo that was published by the Department of Homeland Security saying, I will instruct ICE officers to evaluate on a case-by-case basis whether to revoke parole, which is probably what these people have because they were admitted under the CBP1 app. And if they've been here for less than 2 years, implement something called expedited removal, which means you can yank them out of court and deport them without a hearing, right? They can reassert a fear of persecution, but it does raise major issues. Now, there's a lawsuit that's been filed to block expedited removal. So that was filed by the ACLU, and that is likely to get initially decided sometime in the next couple of days or week, or at least initially decided. But I would say if this family has been here for more than 2 years, and or if they have temporary protected status, which is a status that several Venezuelan people, many Venezuelan populations have, they're probably fine. If they don't, I would want to get them to an immigration attorney to analyze what their risk profile might be. That'd be my take on it. Rich, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, things are moving very quickly, and we really would be well advised to seek counsel. As Hans mentioned, people can be kind of flummoxed with the type of paperwork that they're going to get in terms of you had the status, but now it's a new ball game, and they really need to move quickly. especially as Hans said, if they've been here less than 2 years, we're fearful that the powers that be are going to say, well, sorry, you've got to leave, and there's really nothing you can do.
All right. Hey, Rich, would you mind turning on your camera? Yeah, we want to see you on all
I'm
your
sorry,
videos.
yeah.
That's all right. Next question. How are lower income people going to afford an attorney, especially if the legal centers that have helped them in the past can't get funding because of the recent funding freeze? Any
Yeah,
thoughts on
that's a
that one?
big trouble. Yeah, that's big trouble. There's a program that our local Rocky Mountain Immigrant Advocate Network has done for hundreds of people. You go to immigration court, and there's a small percentage that actually have attorneys, and the other folks are there trying to learn. And I understand that that program has been defunded immediately. And so I'm wondering if there's a way that local people, local churches can get involved so that volunteer attorneys can go and perform that same function, for example.
So would it be a matter of churches raising money to pay those attorneys, or what do you have in? I know you're just thinking about this right now. Is that because I've seen similar action like bail funds created and other things like that. So maybe that kind of approach.
Yeah, well, that was one idea that I've been telling people, to develop bail funds. But yeah, we're also members of another organization for volunteer lawyers, and maybe we could approach them to say, hey, this is kind of a crisis thing. Would you be willing and able to help volunteer lawyers to go and do presentations for people who don't have representation, for example?
Okay, thank you. Hans, did you have anything before we go to the next question?
And you identified probably the biggest issue, right? Which is that they put a stranglehold on funding for nonprofit organizations to serve people who are low income, and it's already a crisis when that infrastructure was in place, and so everybody's going to be strapped. I mean, I think what I've seen in the past is communities coalescing around, GoFundMe's or something if and when a person gets into a situation where they need assistance. My hope is that that funding opens up, but knowing Trump's game plan, if I was his lawyer, that's a critical way to undermine the ability for people to have access to counsel. And I think we need to be prepared for that.
Okay. Hey, Hans, let's just stay with you. Next question is, who do we contact if we see an ICE agent?
Yeah, I think there's a Colorado Rapid Response Network. It's CRRN. There's a hotline number, and I can Google it while we're talking and throw it into the chat or something if you want me to.
Oh,
Uh,
somebody's already put it in the question Q&A. So we will also provide that. We're going to give a resource to everybody. So we'll include that phone number. But
yep,
American Friends Service Committee put that in there. So thank you.
yep, absolutely.
And I had mentioned earlier, to the extent that people can video or audio record what's happening, that could be a key piece of evidence if necessary.
Yeah,
Okay, great.
and
I don't know if you,
I
oh,
can
go ahead.
address this one, which is the one in Spanish.
Yeah. It's good. Thank you.
Yeah, I think as a person saying, look, I have, like I have not done anything bad. I don't drink, I don't have vices. I don't go to parties. And I think what I want to tell that person, Andres, is the good news is because you're in Colorado, unless you have a major run-in, the likelihood of you being picked up by Immigration and Customs Enforcement is very low. Let me repeat that. The likelihood of you being picked up by Immigration and Customs Enforcement is very low. That's an important thing to keep in mind. I'm not saying it's zero, but I'm saying it's very low if you're not in presenting high risks, and those high risks are deportations on your record, serious criminal convictions on your record, or something that pulls you into like what is called the crimmigration pipeline, like in a contact with law enforcement where you get passed over or communicated to ICE. Outside of that, I don't think you have that high of a risk. And for Andreas and other people, it's important just to remember that.
Yeah. Would you mind repeating that in Spanish just in case the closed caption didn't work?
Sure. Andrés, y para la gente que también habla español, si usted anda aquí, no toma licor, no tiene problemas, no tiene antecedentes penales ni como deportaciones previas, mi análisis, yo creo que, quiero ver qué piensa Rich, pero yo creo que el riesgo de ser agarrado por migración es francamente bien bajo, porque tenemos muchas protecciones aquí en el estado de Colorado. Y si una persona no tiene estos como hechos agravantes, probablemente no vamos a encontrar problemas con ICE.
All right, thank
Yeah,
you.
they just don't have the resources, the personnel to do that on the streets. Thank God they don't. But yeah, thank you, Hans. And they really I equate it to, are they going to be able to go to large employers and check for documents versus every little restaurant and business who maybe has somebody working for them, and excuse me, the capacity is just not there.
All right, next question. We have been hearing that churches are public places and they can go in. What is your take? We need some legal advice on this. I think you kind of addressed that with the public-private thing. But you want to go ahead and just, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I think for Michelle, excellent question. And I think this is something that is like very factually driven, right? And a church can do certain things if it wants to create more private areas, right? And that's something that maybe is worth retaining an attorney and working through in a thoughtful way. I mean, if you have a public area, it's a public area. If you have a private area, it's a private area. And you can help distinguish and determine what you want to be public and what you want to be private, knowing that faith communities have sort of a unique, I mean, in many ways, faith communities are inviting people in for worship, right? But there can be limitations and privacy interests put in place to make sure that also people are protected when they're exercising their faith.
And I
All
have a
right.
few notes here just about what to do in terms of planning, develop a policy, here's our file on encounters with law enforcement, for example, do staff trainings about what to do. As Hans alluded to, create a demarcation and create signage, and then create a visitor access policy where it's clear where people are and where they can go and where they can't.
Hey, Rich, let's stay with you for the next one. Question is, I heard that the warrant has to be signed by a federal judge, not just a local judge. Is that true? In ICE warrant.
For immigration purposes, yes, but what happens sometimes is, if you have any kind of old case, the authorities can come and use that to say, look, you're now deportable based on your plea to shoplifting, and we got the judge to sign off on it, and so that could be good enough for a warrant in that circumstance.
Thank you. All right. I think we kind of talked about this, just some questions about sanctuaries being a private space, and I think you all have said it's just kind of how you designate it. Someone asked, if someone is knocking on the door, can they move people into those private spaces while they are knocking on the door?
That's a great question. I think you can. I mean, you have no obligation to stay in a public space. If you have an invitation to go to a private space, you can go to a private space. I think what you want to be a little bit careful and thoughtful about, like avoiding an allegation that you're obstructing or causing problems if officers show up. But if officers show up and they want to ask somebody in the staff some questions, other people are free to leave. They can go wherever they want to, unless they're being detained. I think I would encourage people, if you don't want to be around somebody who's a law enforcement agent, respectfully and slowly, don't get up and run, just choose like, hey, I'm getting out of here. Like, I don't want to be around you, and I think that's absolutely fine. Whether you get a little bit of a sticky widget is if they come in the door and somebody sees them and it just bolts and starts running, because they might say, well, that would give me reason to like suspect that person might be violating the law or whatever. I mean, that's also a stretch, but Rich, I don't know if you have any thoughts on this, but I just say you have to use your judgment in these situations. There's a difference between saying like, hey, we don't want to be here, we're going to move into our private space, which is basically where we do Bible study. There's a difference between that and I'm hiding a person from ICE, right? Like that's an affirmative step that's a little bit different.
Sure. And I mentioned to someone in writing on a question about, there are some old cases how the sanctuary itself is more of a sacred space. And it'll be interesting to see if there are any cases that evolve where authorities come into the sacred space, how this Supreme Court. We'll look at the space itself as sort of a heightened scrutiny, is that we like to say as lawyers, in terms of violating that space.
So are you saying that the law is not really clear on that right now?
There are old cases that I saw in my research, but yeah, it's interesting that people who were charged with um, different acts in the sacred space, again, were held to a higher standard.
Okay. Next question. Are there good templates of policies churches can adopt to guide their interactions with ICE officials who may come to the door? In Aurora, are there risks to allowing entry to a church to local police without a warrant? Either one of you want to take that one?
You want to start on that one, Rich? That's a good set of questions.
Yeah. Yeah, again, as I said, I don't know if necessarily templates, but there's a group, if you want to look them up, called wehaverights.us. And they've studied more on the East Coast, but they certainly have some good advice in terms of what to do in these circumstances. And I would encourage you to look at their website.
Okay, great. All right. How do we know the difference between an?
Let
Oh, I'm
me-
sorry, Hans. Did you want to say something? Yeah.
Let me add to that because I do think this is a great question, and particularly because Aurora's in the eye of the storm, right? And there's a lot of things going on here. I mean, I think there's templates, but templates are templates, right? I would encourage people, like, if they're interested in doing this and making sure to have something happen, it'd probably be good to have something individualized because your community may be a little bit different. Your physical space may be a little bit different. The communities you serve and the people who work there or staff might be a little distinct. I mean, I think there's a template, but an individualized game plan is probably a good idea. And that helps, especially at the point of initial contact and being able to sort of both like navigate that space, exercise those rights in a way that's respectful but firm, you know. And then I think in terms of the question around Aurora, are there serious risks to allowing entry to the church to local police without a warrant? Yeah. I mean, there are, right? I mean, I think the question is, do you want to grant consent to anybody that you don't want in your church or in your space if it's a private space? And maybe there is, right? Maybe the officers are there to respond to a heart attack. Great. That's one thing. What we have seen and has been all over the news is that the Aurora Police Department has been working hand in hand with Immigration and Customs Enforcement at the Dallas apartments at 1282 Dallas. APD will go in and bust down a bunch of doors and drag out dozens of brown people from Venezuela. They will interrogate them. Many of them have done nothing wrong. And then they have handed them over to ICE. That violates state law. It violates civil arrest limits, and it happened. You can look that up. It's on the ACLU website. I was there on scene when that all went down. They had people who didn't have medicine. They had babies ripped away from parents. It was brutal, and it was about 15 degrees outside, right? So I'm not saying that that means every Aurora police officer is a bad person. I'm not trying to be talismanic. What I'm saying is we are in really complicated times. And so grant consent if you want to grant consent. If you don't, don't. Just that simple, right? Now the police may do whatever they want. They may trample all over your right not to consent. That's a problem that's solved later on in court or later on in some sort of negotiation. I think all that we can do is decide, do we want to assert a particular right? Are we going to stand by that right? And then we have to let them do whatever they're going to do.
I was
Hey,
just
go
at
ahead.
a church in Thornton, and the upper floor is the sanctuary, and then they have a garden level basement. And I said, you may want to create some signage that says, just because it's a garden level basement doesn't mean you can come in at your will. It's still part of the space that is part of the sacred part of the church.
All right, looking at the questions, we still have some confusion about administrative warrants versus judicial warrants. So if you could quickly just clarify the the difference and then how people may respond to each one of them.
Go ahead, Hans.
I mean, you're not alone. I think this was Diana, right? Like this is complicated and a little bit nuanced. And so Rich, tell me if I'm like missing something here, but like in the immigration space, like let's talk about immigration agents real quick. There will almost be a 0% chance there will ever be a judicially signed warrant. Rich, I don't know if you've had a judicially signed warrant by a federal judge that an immigration and customs enforcement official has executed when doing civil immigration enforcement, but I've had this many, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Now you will get situations where maybe someone's executing an arrest warrant for a criminal matter that's federal. What you'll be able to tell is that an arrest warrant literally has a signature block in an area for the judge's name, right? And it's signed by a judge. And a lot of times, in addition to that warrant, there's an affidavit attached to it that explains here's what justifies us seizing a person or seizing property without their consent. An administrative warrant is a one-page document that's produced by Immigration and Customs Enforcement, the Department of Homeland Security. It has no judicial signature. It might say, I supervisor and a judge, and a story. So in that situation, those warrants are always administrative. In a state level, almost every warrant is signed by a judge. It's the exact opposite because in the legal system, warrants have to be signed by a judge in a criminal matter. In an immigration matter, they're almost never signed by a judge. So what we tell communities, and whether that's an immigrant community or a person who's staff at a church is, can I please see the warrant? You know, ask to inspect it. It's your property. It's your area, right? And that's where the plan and the preparedness come into play. And it's important. Like maybe you take a photo of it and a video of it, you send it to your lawyer and say, is this an admin warrant or is this a judicial warrant, right? Like, boom, there you go. You've got the backup to be able to deal with that issue. But yeah, there are samples that you can also look up. I have some, but I can't locate them. So you could go to the Colorado Immigrant Rights Coalition website and you could pull up an example of an administrative warrant versus a judicial warrant. But they're pretty easy to tell because of that signature of a judge. And it's an important thing to keep in mind. If it's a state situation and they show up with a warrant, it's almost 100% of the time signed by a court. If immigration and customs agents show up to arrest someone for immigration violation, it's almost 0% signed by a judge.
And the key there is keeping you cool. You know, again, any kind of education training you can do with staff would certainly be helpful because, as I mentioned in writing, you know, there are a lot of tricks to the trade that ICE agents can use, and if they'll say, "I've got a warrant," and be banging on the door, and it's very easy to fall to that. So, any kind of keep your cool seminar would help.
To that point, we've got I'm thinking we're gonna take two more questions. So one has been a question about training. And one question was, who can actually give consent to ICE? Does it have to be someone official? Can anybody give consent? And related to that is, do you have any suggestions for where people can find resources to train their staff? Because we'll make those available. So, and then the last question is about preschool. So, given those two questions, which one wants to take this idea of who can give consent and training?
Hmm.
You want to take that one, Hans?
Sure. So this, I can't say this is like necessarily bright line, but the general rule is you can't give consent to something that you don't have any control over. Like I can't give consent to search Rich's house. Sure, search Rich's house, right? You know, like that would be silly, right? That's just not legally justifiable. So I think is the general benchmark is, you know, let's say it's a church, like a person who works for the church, a staff member, possibly even a volunteer could potentially give consent, right? Not potentially, probably could give consent and that consent would be valid. Where things get a little sticky is sometimes, and there's a little bit of play here for officers and other people is like they could say, well, I was relying on a person who I thought could give consent, right? Like in the moment, I couldn't like Google them and like research whether or not they had an employee-employer relationship. This is part of the training, right? If there's people in the congregation who don't work there and aren't part of it, and if they're contacted, their first answer is, I can't give consent. You need to talk to somebody who works here, right? Like, I can't tell you to go into Rich's house. I can't tell you you can go into Adrian's car. So I think those are important ways to try to bulwark against, immigration trying to gin up consent from someone who can't give it, right? Now, good officers and good cops will follow the law, and bad officers and bad cops won't, right? And so what we need to do is always hope that we have people who follow the law and prepare for situations in which people might try to cut the corners, right? And that's a perfect example of, hey, I got one consent from some guy walking out the door, and so I walked straight in here. And in those situations, you might be able to have a staff member immediately go in and say, "I'm sorry, that was a person who was a member of our congregation. They don't work here. They have no authority. They can't give you consent. I'm revoking the consent. I need you to leave." Right? And that's a way that you can go back and retract consent or clarify to the officer that they didn't have it to begin with.
Hey, thank you.
And with respect to the preschool question, that's a little tougher, because if, a parent drives up in a public space and they're going into the private space, where's the line in terms of where they can be questioned or stopped? And yeah, that's a little more tricky, because if you're on a public street and they know who you are, they can certainly ask for your documents, but once you enter the preschool, it could be inaccessible.
Thank you. Well, friends, we have so many other questions, but just so much time. So thank you so much for your expertise in what you've brought here. I think I've learned a lot. I hope everyone on this webinar has learned a lot. Again, we will be providing a document with links to some of the things that were mentioned here, like the hotline, other organizations you can consult. They're going to send me some documents. We'll create a folder that you all will have links to, so that you can access those documents. And then, given the other questions we haven't answered, we might do another webinar to dig a little deeper on some of these subjects. So again, this was informational. So if you're thinking about developing something for your congregation, please take time to actually retain an attorney who knows what they're talking about. So you could figure out what you want to do. You want to have a policy in place. You want to train your staff, and then work towards developing a rapid response action plan for these things. We already know that they're happening in other parts of the country. Colorado has been mentioned, and so it's likely to happen here. So we just need to be prepared. To close, I want to remind us of the words from the prophet Zechariah in chapter 7, verses 9 through 10. This is what the Lord Almighty said: administer true justice, show mercy and compassion to one another. Do not oppress the widow or the fatherless, the foreigner or the poor. And I'll close out with a prayer by the United Methodist Committee on Relief. Oh God, open our eyes that we might see the needs of asylum seekers, refugees, and undocumented immigrants. Open our ears that we may hear people's cries for justice. Open our hearts that we may assist sojourners near and far. Show us where love, hope, and faith are needed. Use us as ministers of your healing. Let us not be afraid to protect the weak because of the anger of the strong, or to defend the poor because of the power of the rich. Sustain us so that we, in those coming days, may be able to do some work of peace for you. Amen. Please find out more. Colorado Council of Churches will provide the website. And if you're not on our distribution list for communications, please stay in touch with us so we can provide more important information in these times. Thank you so much for joining us. Again, this recording will be made available for later viewing. Blessings to you all, and thank you for being with us tonight. And thank you for all that you do.
Thank you, Adrian.
Thank you.